Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. This is Inside the Medicsy. I have my guest, Will, with me today. How you doing, Will?
Great. How are you, Doug?
I'm okay. It's a little chilly down here. I'm in what they're calling now deep South Texas. And I don't know, it feels like maybe I'm back in Alaska here. So a little weird, but we decided we were it's been a while, we're gonna get together and have a chat and include all of you all in our chat. And we're gonna call it the Ape of the Church today. It's been a part of different traditions to sometimes refer to Satan as the ape of God. Satan tends to counterfeit God, or as I've argued in the past, invert the works of God. So we're going to explore that idea that's been bandied about by the likes of Archbishop Vigano and Schneider, and think through that a little bit and pull it back to Will has become quite a collaborator. The work we're doing right now, seeing through the metaverse, the cosmic conspiracy to replace Western civilization. So Will is not crazy about the kind of handle Ape of the Church. It's kind of a little imperfect, but I think it's a good starting point for our conversation. So I thought before we kind of continue too long, I'm not exactly sure anybody checking in with us, listening, where they're at in terms of their beliefs. But I suppose it's a good idea for Will and myself to quickly kind of go over our take on where the Catholic Church is right now. Is it the Whore of Babylon? Is it Christ Church? Let me flip it over to you, Will. You are, if you don't mind me saying, you are in an RCIA program right now in a traditional Catholic church out in the rolling hills of Kentucky. You've seen a lot of crazy things, probably exploring the internet in the last several years relating to the Catholic Church. There's that big room with the snake you were just talking about a moment ago offline. And the apocalyptic room. And if you would have asked me a year ago, I would have just thought a person would have to be crazy to stay in this church and really touched in the head to want to go into it from outside. Can you kind of explain where you're at with it? I think what I'm sensing is we're in agreement on this idea, this biblical idea of two seeds, that there will be two seeds until the end of time, the wheat and the tares, and they're going to be housed in the church. However, we can debate how we're going to define the church. What are your thoughts right now, Will?
Sure, Doug. So, I've mentioned before, I grew up in a Protestant background. So like you, in order to enter into the Catholic Church, we have to go through a type of educational process in which we're catechized, basically. So we learn about the Holy Sacraments, and we learn about the history of the church and the magisterium, the deposit of faith, these sorts of things. So I was actually in this process in early 2020 before the pandemic rolled out, and I was just kind of frightened by the response of the church that I was in. I was something that most, Protestant, and non-religious truthers are not aware of is the crisis that's been unfolding in the Catholic Church over the last 150 years, but specifically since the 1960s with this Second Vatican Council that took place, that basically overhauled the entire fabric of how the church imagines itself, overhauled the rites of the seven sacraments, and in the liturgy of the Mass. So there is the traditional Latin Mass, which is spoken primarily in Latin, that has been in place for, in various formats for 1500 or no, 1900 years. And in the 1960s, there was an effort to make that more secularly accessible. They actually, this council recruited Freemasons and Protestants to help devise a liturgy that would be more accessible, so that it could create more, I guess, just make the church more accessible to a broader group of people. So anyway, what you were saying about the ape of the church, that, I think it's a useful metaphor, but it kind of lacks in the sense that it doesn't incorporate the major typology of prophecy of the serpent, the seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman, which reappears throughout prophetic scripture. And the ape image gives it a sense of it being just solely about, which it is, a mimicry, a simulation of the true source of the divine, and brings it down to earth and makes it more of a kind of bestialization. But we also know through reading scripture and also studying the esoteric traditions that this is a system of the serpent, of the Ouroboros, of the caduceus, of the Nakash, these different serpent metaphors that is a kind of simulation or mimic of the way the Holy Spirit activates the mystical body of Christ. So anyway, I'll leave it to you from there. There's more I could say, but we'll get into it.
Right. Okay. There's so many ways we can go with the two seeds. So a lot of throughout the history of Protestantism over the last 500 years, different sects will identify different phases where there was a church and then it went apostate. For example, in Mormonism or many of the 19th and 20th century startup churches that tend to be American, the idea was that the book of Acts, boom, it's all over. The church that Christ started, or the church that God ordained, fell into immediate apostasy until, whether it's Joseph Smith or Campbell or whomever else. So, when in a lot of Mormons that start to wake up, kind of think that doesn't make a lot of sense. Many denominations will start with Constantine and the paganization. Lutherans and Anglicans tend to say it happened around the Reformation, but certainly an agreement among all Protestants would be that generally the Catholic Church was Romanized, certainly by the late Middle Ages, and is essentially defunct. So the two seeds doctrine, if we think of the mystical body of Christ, I can give you a catechized version of that. I don't want to necessarily define that right now, but the mystical body of Christ would have wheat and tares. So if, according to a Catholic position, that Christ initiated this church, gave Peter the keys to the kingdom through apostolic succession, the people in that succession are able to bind and loosen sins. This would be the church that Christ promised that, at least in the sacraments, he'd be present in until the end of the age. So we have to deal with this idea right now that's up there, even among the many different strains of traditional Catholics, that we might indeed be living in an age of apostasy, perhaps the great apostasy, of which the Bible speaks, and so many other Catholic prophecies. So, so I'll kind of leave it right there, but it is possible and consistent with Catholic doctrines that you can have an apostate church and that Christ will still be present in it. The question starts, we can ask, are we at the end of the age? And my sense of that is that no, we're not at the end of the age yet, but I do have a very strong sense that we're in an age of apostasy. And let me just finish by saying this. I tend to think, I don't want to think for a Protestant here, but I tend to think they just don't get the significance of what's going on in the Vatican right now. A lot of people kind of wake up to the Logos, Christ incarnate, when they kind of look at the New World Order and the Cabal and what are the attacks, who are the targets of them. It is this tradition against the family, against Western civilization, against individual rights. These are all true. And I think what Protestants might miss is that Catholicism itself has always been the target and the monarch and the Catholic monarchs. But today, the Vatican is the microcosm of what's going on in the rest of the world. So I think that to understand the real target and the final blow as we move from the fourth industrial revolution into the circular information economy is the idea of the sacraments and the attack on those sacraments and the attack on the Catholic tradition and the attack on the Roman Mass, or I'll call it the traditional Mass done in Latin. And for a Protestant, they probably would assume, oh, I thought that was defunct 500 years ago or 2,000 years ago. No, that is all eyes within the wheat. I'll call it the tares inside of the church, who whether have been there from the beginning or in part infiltrated the church, to forces outside the church. Especially in the last year, in the last 6 months, the key target of the New World Order is the traditional Mass, and it's just rolling out. So for the people that have been observing this for years, their minds are getting blown each day as these attacks increase. And it's hard for us to imagine, Christ spoke Aramaic, the Bible was written in Hebrew and Greek. Why Latin? Why the significance? And there is a historical consciousness that goes with this, that the Latin Mass is extremely significant, whether or not a priest is doing an exorcism and demonstrates the power of that exorcism through the traditional Latin pattern, or whether it's the consecration of the host done in Latin. But for Will and I, and I'm going to get off the stop talking here for a moment. That's what we keep noticing every day. All attacks come back to something that the Vatican wants to kill and destroy. The significance of this that we can maybe talk about is that the church is both, like the nature of Christ, is both divine and earthly. It's the ark that takes people into the final new heaven and new earth, the finished work of Christ. And it's probably typified in the Mass itself. So as far as the attacks on the traditional Mass, if people aren't aware of this, it's so crazy, because people that are doing what's been done for 2,000 years are considered schismatic. It's almost like calling the truckers up in Canada, racist or Nazis. It's that insane. while the kind of new mass gets crazier and crazier and crazier, more Protestant, more Protestant, more secular, more secular, more secular. The traditional mass is getting stomped out day after day after day. Will, what are you thinking?
Yeah, sure. So I've actually been able to locate a traditional Latin mass in my area. It's kind of in a nice country setting. It's like a 200-year-old chapel, and it's like so there are different. I'm still coming to understand a lot of the terminology, within the structure of the church, but it's an organization called the FSSP, which is in communion with the Vatican, but has a special appointment or designation in which it's permitted to continue the Latin Mass. But this relationship is becoming increasingly tenuous and restricted in a lot of the major dioceses, like in Chicago recently. They've cracked down and said that they can't have Latin masses on any of the holy feast days, on Easter or Christmas, on the first Sundays of each month. Yet anything else under the sun is permitted in the Novus Ordo masses. Novus Ordo is the new liturgy of the Mass that was established in the 1960s under the Second Vatican Council, if I didn't explain that earlier. Just to backtrack here, that auditorium that is so famous that in Truth or Land in Rome or in Vatican City, that's in the shape of the head of the serpent and has the bizarre apocalyptic angel, spirit, demon appearing out of the atomic dust cloud in bronze or whatever that is. It's called the Pope Pope Paul VI auditorium, who was the Pope who oversaw the Second Vatican, or consummated the Second Vatican Council, and he subsequently met with the United Nations and called for the establishment of the New World Order and a international police force and international military, and the dissolvement of national sovereignties. Within the Catholic Church, there's this major conflict that's appearing between traditionalists and sort of the Novus Ordo mainstream church. And traditionalists are being pathologized, canceled, made the subjects of attacks. And anyway, going to this traditional Mass, one of the things that most stands out is that the priest conducts, the Latin portions of the liturgy facing the altar, not facing the congregation. So something that happened within the Catholic churches after the 1960s is that they all started being made like auditorium style in the round. So the congregation is facing one another, and there's a sense of, collective consciousness within the Mass. So in this traditional setting, it's your shotgun seating where you've got parallel rows all facing the altar, and then the priest is, and you have this very verticalized altar, with various candles and the tabernacle where the host of the Holy Eucharist is kept, and he performs the rites of the Mass facing the altar, facing away from the audience. So the focus of the Second Vatican Council was to create a man-centered theology, ecumenism that could incorporate all different faith backgrounds, so that we're all a part of this mystical body now, rather than it being something where the mystical body metaphor points back to the head, which is Christ, and we're all members within that head, within the traditional concept of the church hierarchy. So it's an attack on hierarchy, it's an attack on tradition. Stepping into this traditional Mass service, it's like stepping out of time is the only way. I've been to a Novus Ordo Mass for years. I've been to many Protestant megachurch situations, more traditional, like the country church that my dad grew up in. It's similar to that, but just the sense of the sacred, the divine, the holy being separated from the secular world and being united within this intergenerational sanctity of the mystical body is something that's it's almost overwhelming. So, I really recommend for your audience and people listening, if they've never experienced something like this, you can go online, you can Google like traditional mass finder, and you can put in your zip code and you can find one in your area. Typically, but for a very short period of time, because it really appears like, especially with Pope Francis, public enemy number one of the Catholic Church, of the Vatican at this point in time, is to cancel these traditional rites and masses.
It's almost like the early Christians had to meet in the catacombs, and it's almost going full. It's like this fruit has developed and it's almost ready to fall off the vine. It's going full circle that the traditional mass in short order might have to be produced underground, so to speak. Let me bring up a concept here. Let's talk about apostasy a little bit. The current Pope, where do you begin? So this has been going on for years, but even among observers, it just, when you think it can't get any more bizarre, and yesterday or the day before saying that basically there is no such thing as a heretic or an outsider, or everybody's saved, everybody's part of the mystical body. So, what we go back and forth, and at what point are people gonna, start to kind of wonder? So here's one of the big things that we have talked about. The Vatican is issuing these green passes. So over there, I guess if you want to get into the Vatican, you have to have whatever 2 doses and a booster and whatever. Now when you think of the wheat and tares, we're talking about the Pope pushing, the obviously the big pharma military industrial complex shot, saying, like many Protestants would be saying in different mega churches, is that, Jesus would take the shot. Well, at the same time, we have voices such as Schneider that's saying that this is tainted. This has got, the Catholic position of life is that when the union of the two, the male and the female, at that moment, the soul comes into it and it's precious and has a destiny for eternity, possibly. So he's saying that the pharmaceutical industry could make these, whatever you want to call it, shots, without it. The fact that they're in there says there's an agenda. He said it's tainted. Once it goes in your body, you're essentially performing cannibalism. It's tainted by this corrupt industry. So at least that voice is out there. But that's, I think, the best juxtaposition of the highest voices around the world would be the established church, at least in terms of the profile of them, are saying something diametrically opposed. As the Pope is saying something diametrically opposed with the deposit of faith, you got Vigano saying that essentially this is the mark of the beast. So whether it's a type of mark or a prelude to the mark, we can argue about, or, people can discuss that idea. But yes, it's interesting times. And I think it calls together a lot of questions. If the Holy Spirit leads you to all truth, why are some people that seem to be good Protestants, good Christians, good Catholics, not seeing the great apostasy, not only in the church, but all around us? And so that would probably bring us to the tool that we're using, is the egregore, the demonically charged thought form that has been created. And this goes to pre-Vatican, but who we've been, using is the idea of Tomberg best develops the idea of the egregore. And even back in the 1950s and 60s, he was talking about an egregore of the Catholic Church versus the true Catholic Church. Thoughts on that, Will?
Yeah, I think that what I was saying about the ape and the serpent, I think, speaking of it as an egregore is probably another, broader step back that encompasses both, and how there can be a true Catholic Church, the true seed of the woman, and then the seed of the serpent, or this counterfeit simulation standing in its way, and how that, but the egregore suggests a horizontality. It's something that's drawn from this convocation of ecumenical energy, of the brotherhood of man, or of this kind of vision of equality and fraternity, in place of the traditional hierarchy of, God, apostolic priesthood, laity. And then that also encompasses the family and just the traditional structure of Western civilization that is based upon this chain of being that starts from God and trickles down into the various forms of authority. So when authority is spread out or made horizontal and intersectional, intertextual, whatever these postmodern buzzwords that we throw around that are basically a network society, a thousand plateaus. It's just another way of saying an egregore, which is this eschatological fantasy of, the serpent chasing its own tail, the circular economy that can self-perpetuate and produce or replace this, traditional hierarchy of Western civilization.
Right. So we have to try to kind of keep things simple, because I know a lot, we're making references that are mostly between the material we've been reading. But what we call the metaxy, the great chain of being, it's the hierarchy. Really, it's a hierarchy of angels that connect heaven and earth. And it's transcendent and it's absolute. So that's what the target is, the verticalness, and the idea is to make it horizontal, like the figure 8 serpent with the tail going forever, infinity on the horizontal, sucking the essence or the form of the vertical and transposing it into the infinite vertical. In other words, creating the heaven on earth, immanentizing the eschaton. So now with the transcendent, the idea in Orthodox theology is that God stands outside of creation and all of creation is dependent upon God. And secondly, the absolute quality is this is God is absolute reality. He's made manifest in the vertical, the radiation that comes down through essentially the angels in the church, the angels in the hierarchy into the church and into the sacraments. And this is the lifeblood of not only the church, but of Western civilization. So sometimes there are contemporary sort of blue-pilled Catholics, and they'll embrace what's called the hermeneutic of continuity, that essentially Vatican II is the same as any previous liturgy or mass. It's just a couple tweaking of the words. But what you have to kind of really pay attention to is the absolute. If something's absolute, you only have to tweak it a little bit before it's relative. And you really have to be noticing for this absolute nature of the verticalness. Now, for the egregore creation, according to Thomberg, this is the radiation that comes and fills. It's perfect love. You can't make an egregore out of perfect love. You can't make an egregore out of the true church, the true mass, the true sacraments, but they can be transposed into something that have the form, but certainly not the essence. And that's really this is part of the great deception that was around in Paul's time, that he writes so much about within the church, and it's never left the church. It appears that the tares now in the early 21st century have kind of built this egregore that seems to be the Catholic Church. But if you're not attached to the true radiation, you're on a different path. And not to beat this down too much, but Thomberg would say how you kind of know is egregores enfold. They take the radiation and it's alchemical. It has to work with something else to become a third thing. It's alchemical. There's a male principle and a female principle. So they're taking the radiation and alchemically transposing it into something earthly. What I finished off the book on, Seeing Through the Singularity, was the egregore of earthly Jerusalem. That's the project, whether people know it or don't know it, this idea that people are taking what seems to be unfulfilled scripture and trying to realize it in the natural, here and now. They're immanentizing it. Instead of the Christ, the Godhead being outside of order, they're putting the Godhead inside of order, and it's a process theology in which we contribute to the plan of God, not in the sense that it's doing the will of God, which is focusing on the eschaton, the finished work of God, in which all prophecies necessary for salvation are fulfilled, but creating a heaven here on earth, or following the promises of this world, or of science, or of technology, trying to live forever, trying to go in, instead of the narrow gate, another way. Well, well, we did quite a bit right there with you got the two seeds going on. We talked a little bit about apostasy, but I part of what, we were saying is we kind of might have to explain to people where we're coming from. How could you go into this church during the great apostasy? And I too am going through our CIA, and I'll start receiving some of the sacraments in the next few months. I feel the light, I feel the presence of Christ like I never have before. I'm less tuned into the emotional part, and just look at the consistency of that deposit of faith. And that is what I'm more interested in attaching myself to right now, is what I find to be sound doctrine.
Sure, yeah. And for me, the first time around when I was in RCIA, this issue of the real presence is something that I didn't have a way of making sense of, or I was still sort of skeptical of, like, why does it have to be this, literal interpretation of, like, the physical flesh of Christ? Why can't it just be a metaphor? Why can't it just be an act of faith? But now that I'm digging more heavily into this, and also I have the counterexample of the sacramental economy of, the MNRA shot and all these other sacraments that are controlling our, our society, and how we are given access to this, this new world order basically that's appearing. It allows me to understand that, they have to replace this traditional sacramental system and put something else in its way in order to hijack and parasite the transcendental power of that old system. So the act of the Holy Eucharist, the true presence. Something else I want to backtrack here and say really quick before I forget. My wife, she became Catholic before I did. So I was, she would say the rosary every day, and I was just kind of like, this rote prayers, and, just, isn't this what is mentioned in the scripture about babbling on, and to keep your prayers simple and short. And so anyway, that's something I was always skeptical of. But recently, as I've mentioned before, my daughter and her disability, she's plagued with sleeplessness. She'll be up 2 hours every night, just about, and she's really loud. I can't sleep. It's something I've been dealing with for several years, and it's a major encumbrance on our life. So my wife and I started saying the rosary together before we put her to bed over the last month, and she's been sleeping through the night almost every single night. So something I just wanted to report and share. Maybe pure coincidence, but I do feel like there is some spiritual protection over our house whenever we do this together. And it's like joining ourselves with this blockchain, the rosary beads as a type of blockchain that connects us back through time to
the medicacy and the great chain of being.
Yes.
Historical consciousness that we're participating with the heavens and the earth. And the pinnacle point of all of this, between heaven and earth and the grand convocation, takes place in the Eucharist. And like you said, it's transhistorical, and it's sort of out of time.
Yeah.
It's participation with the saints, and that's precisely the target of the metaverse. And so what's growing on the metaverse is the meta church. Before I continue with the meta church, it's a handy handle, because egregores are demonically charged thought forms, or ethereally charged thought forms. meta thought forms. So what we're thinking about, the meta egregore, it's the egregore that's the granddaddy of all egregores that takes them in. And we can talk about little sub egregores, things that are thought forms that are produced outside the medici. But yeah, the metaverse church, it's some of the major mega churches already signed on to it. Hillsong signed on to it. It's growing with the bigger churches and the smaller churches. And at the end of the day, I believe the target of this is the elimination of the physical contact between the water that's necessary for regeneration during baptism, and of course the Eucharist, which is physical. And that's the idea of this church that's been around 2,000 years, that nobody questioned the sacramental nature of the church. It reflects Christ. He's man, fully God. The physical church with a couple physical instruments were left there to help us mediate between heaven and hell. And they are specifically what Christ ordained. If you want to abide in me, you must eat my body, drink my blood. So I do think that that's the final kind of pivot to the New World Order, is not only the destruction of Christianity per se, but it's the physical presence of Christ in the Eucharist on earth. And I think that when that ceases, that will be the end of our age. So among the various sort of veins of traditional Catholicism, there's each of them are sort of problematic, and it's hard to go into all of this, but there's a hard focus usually with Vatican II. And I think the case that Michael Hoffman makes is that it's not the apostasy, but the deep corruption within the church is very old. It's not ancient, but it's from probably the late medieval period. And I'll let Will talk about this a little bit, but for Hoffman, oftentimes Protestants, in particular the Lutheran and Calvinistic strain, get kind of strapped with this idea that that's where usury begins, and that's the beginning of capitalism or monopoly capitalism, and that the really corrupting influences of Western civilization began with Protestantism. And Hoffman points out that no, it's really all of the seeds for most of these apostasies, one way or another, are inside of the church. The wheat and the tares back inside of the church. And that during the Renaissance period in particular, and you maybe think about the Medicis and all the great art that comes from that period, he kind of turns that around. And again, humanism being essentially Luciferianism in conjunction with usury is introduced into the church, into the Vatican. And he sees this as just a, with some exceptions, some popes here and there, this is kind of par for the course over the last 500 years. So I guess what Will and I are about to say is as Will's addressing this, is we're quite aware that the problems in Catholicism go back to not only the Renaissance, but the first churches started in the Apocalypse of John that he addresses. We both read some of that Hoffman material. I know Will really enjoyed it. What are some things that stood out for you, Will?
Yeah, so, first of all, Renaissance means rebirth. And there was at the time a renewed interest and investment in perceived ancient wisdom and philosophy, Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, the Kabbalah even, which began to be presented by various theologians and sources in the medieval church that were not persecuted in the way that we're led to believe through the conventional history of the Inquisition. Hoffman brings up three characters in particular. Pico della Mirandola is one. Reuchlin, I think is how you pronounce it, which was a Bavarian or German Kabbalistic philosopher, and a Ficino character, and how they were shielded and protected by the papal hierarchy and how they protected the Talmud. There were efforts made to reveal the secrets of the Talmud and the Kabbalah to the church and the hierarchy, and to repress those sources or even burn those books. And these three characters that Hoffman mentions work to protect them and actually defend them as Christian sympathy, things that prove the Christian theology and should be incorporated into the faith. So these are the early strains of what became the Rosicrucian movement, the Freemasonry, and the Great Apostasy that we're seeing today. There's another document that surfaces in the 18th century called the Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, which is written by an Italian Carbonari Freemason who writes under the pen name El Pico Tigre, I believe is how you say it. And I challenge any of your Protestant listeners to check out that document, because it's basically an overview of the overhaul of Western civilization through subduing the church, through its hierarchy, through its seminaries, and ultimately to take control of the papacy and to redirect it toward this project of humanism. So this book, recommended here, I've got it here, it's the Occult Renaissance Church of Rome by Michael Hoffman. It's like 600 pages or so, but it's pretty satisfying book, and gives a lot of context to understanding, the origins of Masonry and how Kabbalism was folded into the religious hierarchy of the Middle Ages. And also it helps to explain things like, the prevalence of what they call in traditional circles the lavender mafia within the Catholic Church, this pedophilia and homosexuality within the priesthood, and how these things are shielded from persecute, or not from persecution, but from justice through this enshrinement of this esoteric philosophy.
Yeah, I'm still reading the book. It's very good. So it seems that, yes, the church has always had the wheats and the tares, and some of these things that seem to be manifesting today are much deeper than people maybe imagine. And maybe there is way too much emphasis on Vatican II. That said, something that springs out of Vatican II, it's argued among many traditionalists and sedevacantists that it's a new religion. And that versus the idea of a continuity or hermeneutic of continuity. Personally, I guess I take sort of a middle position on that, but Vatican II definitely in its ecumenical form, at the very least, dilutes the church. But what we are going to argue is essentially Vatican II is an egregore of the Catholic Church. It's very similar. And maybe just like, there's a lot of religions you can get a buzz and a charismatic high from. So I don't know that that should be a necessary indicator if something is sound. But Vatican II, as it's being rolled out right now, the manifestations of what happened back in the late 60s, early 70s, is we're seeing it right now with the current Pope and with all of the powers virtually within the cardinals coming down against this traditional mass and the real presence of Christ in that's made through the traditional mass. And the story just seems just like all the other crazy stories in the world. I mean, it's just, I really think the microcosm of this New World Order is really being played out in the Vatican. And the significance of that, I suppose, if we want to kind of push this idea to its conclusion, is the idea of the Antichrist. And I think with the church fathers, for the most part, that Antichrist was both a system, but also going to be a singular man. Since Satan apes God and there is an ape of the church, Christ was a singular individual that came in the form of the Logos, God incarnate. And so the ape, or the inversion of that, would be a man of lawlessness, as Thessalonians mentions. So it does seem like so many of the events over the last 500 years, especially the last 100 years, especially after the last 2 years, seem to be the world, at least parts of the world, or at least the tares within the world, preparing the world for Antichrist. And something that would have, I know I got pushback on this 2 years ago, that I think it's to people that think all this religious stuff sounds crazy. It is funny that a blueprint is being rolled out that is the inversion of the will of God through the Mass, the Eucharist, and the focus upon the creeds and the eschaton of the church, which is focused on the finished work of Christ, not the construction of a third temple, not the imminent return of Christ before the rapture, and then he's going to come back again. So, I mean, as right now, before I turn it over to you, one of the things that we can actively do is kind of shut our minds down to, I think, so much of just general misdirection going on right now. There's, it's hard. There's so much stuff going on in the world. But the bottom line, I think, in terms of the continuation of the convocation of the Mass and the deposit of faith, is essentially being true to those simple things, which are the creeds of the church. What do you think, Will?
Sure. Yeah. Like you said earlier, there cannot be an egregore of pure love. So the creation, or as Thunberg would say, to engender an artificial demon or an egregore, it takes chaos, trauma, fear primarily, in order to unleash these things. And so, that gives an extra context to understanding how, trauma-based mind control, or the media pumping out this propaganda of fear on a daily basis that they won't let us, escape or move on from. The war on terror.
It's a meta egregore creation. It's the granddaddy egregore of the immunization. Yeah.
Right. So
preparing us for the solution to end all of this chaos.
Right. And I'd also like to mention, like, within, the 7 sacraments are, a system of unifying our will and imagination, our body and our mind, within this radiant love of the divine Godhead who stands outside of creation. That has been inverted and attacked throughout time with, you might look at like the 7 chakras within, like, kind of, Eastern theosophy, or you might look at the 7 lower sephirot of the tree of life, and how to access these different portals of transcendental understanding. There's usually some sort of initiatic rite that evokes a state of fear of death, or having your arms pulled from you by 2 horses, or your throat cut, and whatever these Masonic threats are of revealing secrets. But like whatever is going on around the issue of, like, ritual child abuse, you see within the writings of Aleister Crowley, or in Anton LaVey, who, by the way, Anton LaVey in the Satanic Bible explicitly praised the Second Vatican Council and spoke of how the use of Latin was deplorable to Satan. How the abuse of children is ritualized as a way of harnessing, parasiting this spiritual power that can be redirected into creating, a mass psychosis.
Right. And so, mass psychosis, that is part of the agenda. Let me just give somebody a little intro into some of what we're writing right now. This is seeing through the metaverse. the cosmic conspiracy to replace Western civilization. In Seeing Through the Singularity, Uncovering the Cosmic Conspiracy, 2000, the Singularity Project was presented as the culmination of Western civilization and the conclusion of world affairs, i.e. trans and then posthumanism. In contrast, Seeing Through the Metaverse will present the quote unquote metaverse project as the wholesale replacement of Western civilization by means of mass psychosis and postmodern fantasy. Let me continue just one more paragraph right here. So the metaverse is presented to the public as a full spectrum technological simulacron of reality, i.e. virtual reality. The contemporary marketing of metaverse focuses upon the interplay between high technology and the subjective human experience that together create virtual reality. The metaverse as currently presented assumes an absence of supernatural activity with the interplay of forces that create virtual reality. In contrast, we will explore the metaverse as a phenomenon as both an egregore and a potential operating platform for human consciousness. The metaverse, in this sense, is a demonically generated meta-thought form designed to produce ever higher levels of mass psychosis in order to replace Western civilization as the principal source of meaning, connectivity, and purpose. Ultimately, we argue metaverse is the culmination of a trans-historical spiritual project that represents the grand deception and final great apostasy St. Paul refers to in 2 Thessalonians. And that is that with all, this is St. Paul now, with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish because they did not accept the love of the truth so as to be saved. For this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence so that they will believe what is false. And so seeing through the singularity, seeing through the metaverse means seeing through the technologically induced virtual reality experience into the darkness of the meta egregore creation, these demonically generated thought forms that manifest within human consciousness as archetypes, paradigms, and memes, ultimately creating an ideological consciousness or prepackaged isms. Here, seeing through the metaverse means seeing the meta egregore as an alternative operating platform that corresponds to Marx's, that's Karl Marx's, model of reality, which results from the interplay between the economic base and the superstructure. Marxism perverts human will and imagination in order to construct an alternative artificial reality. This artificial reality, we will see, produces mass psychosis when the individual and the collective body, mind, and spirit participate in this age-old project designed to immanentize the eschaton or bring heaven to earth. Now, let me just finish by reading a footnote here from Marx's Dialectic Materialism, from Botanica and also Palgrave. Marx's philosophy of dialectic materialism is defined as a theory of reality. Now, bear in mind, Marx didn't believe in God. He believed in demons, and this superstructure was about the economic base interacting with the superstructure in order to create these demons, these thought forms. He's pretty explicit about that, in fact. Which affirms so dialectic materialism is defined as a theory of reality which affirms the continuous transformation of matter and the interconnectedness of things and ideas, that's the Internet of Things, which will ultimately bring about a universal anti-state, one world utopia. So what Marx is talking about is a type of pantheism. It's consistent with Teilhard de Chardin's idea of this final omega point, a stateless world, a blob of love. So that's the creation, and it takes much of the form of the church, and it tries to rob the essence, but it's, in a sense, it's a dead project that always ultimately leads to political and social derailment and some type of cultural collapse. So I suppose I went on a little bit more than I wanted to, and you hate to always be beating down on Karl Marx, the poor guy. But what he's saying is it's really a fancy 19th century repackaging of ancient Kabbalah. and that is through the Sephirot, which is it's an ape of the vertical order. In the end, you'll always end up on the, let's say, the figure 8 snake, which is Mark Zuckerberg's logo right now. He has that right on his Meta, and it couldn't be much more in your face, which brings us back to the idea that everybody pounds on, why can't people see? but that's the project unfolding before us, as we see in terms of seeing through the metaverse. Some stuff probably popped into your mind there as I was going on and on. Will, what are you thinking?
Oh, yeah, I think you nailed it on the head there, especially with linking Marx to this metaverse and Zuckerberg project, and the construction of artificial reality through harnessing these collective demons as, deceptive thought forms that harvest, will and imagination from, a materially focused collective population. I guess it's maybe something that pops to me is like this interest in materialism, as opposed to the transubstantiation of the material of the Eucharistic sacrament, and how those two things can be compared, contrasted, or the way in which the material economy is invested with a type of spiritual power within Marx's universe.
Yeah, let me say this.
Yeah.
St. Paul says, in response to getting sucked into the deluding influences of our age that are sent to us by God for not loving the truth, he gives somewhat of a solution. So you say, what do you want to do about it? Well, here's what Paul says we can do about it.
Yeah.
What are you going to do about it? Who are you going to vote for? So
Mhm.
Paul says here, 2 Thessalonians 2:11, following the previous thought. So he's definitely responding to the deluding influences. So then, brothers and sisters, stand firm and hold on to the traditions which you were taught, whether by mouth or letter.
Mhm.
And so the egregore, therefore, seeks to unravel the Christian foundations of Western civilization encapsulated in the deposit of faith and the holy sacraments, because that's what's left connecting us to reality and holding on to that reality that can save us, as opposed to a reality that is a simulation of reality. And so together we're going to use the works of Vogelin, Valentine Tomberg, and Archbishop Vigano to more fully understand the lifeblood of the church and Western civilization and the deposit of these traditions. And so one of our appeals is to pull the consciousness not only toward the eschaton, but have it grounded in the traditions and the deposit of faith and that was left to us, that we're inheritors of, and of the holy sacraments, which I think we have argued. I think the last time we got together, we discussed it's like the threading, the inner threading of this body holding Western civilization together. And it's with the attack on the traditional mass, those are the last final threads, I think, holding us together. And I'm just saying, I think it's unfortunate that's a little bit lost on the Protestants, that they just don't see the significance of the tradition. They accept the Bible, that is their tradition, although they don't necessarily understand why. And I think they recognize, at least symbolically, some of the sacraments, but these are truly the connecting threads between heaven and earth, and it is the will of God that we abide in him through these sacraments. What are you thinking, Will?
Yeah, and like you're saying, what can we do? How can we be positive actors in this process? How can we hold back this psychic epidemic that's being unleashed onto the world? And it's not a matter of this type of I mean, there's spiritual work to be done through uniting our will and imagination to the proper source of truth. When we have this break in the chain, or we're trying to, through our own ecstatic efforts of, praise and worship, or our own personal interpretations of the scripture, thinking that we can have a divine revelation, or the gift of the Holy Spirit that's going to transform reality. It's really what we're asked to do over and over again in scripture and through the example of tradition, is to subject our will and imagination to this greater project that we're only a small member within.
Excellent. Yeah. And that's it. That's what the egregore comes, the will and imagination. So if you're leaving it to the world or other actors or whatever movement might be going on, or charismatic movement, or that's why, I've been going for the last couple of years, is just, Tolberg would say, quiet the mind at that moment. Fix your will and imagination. This is what creates the egregore through perversion, allows the demonic charge to go in there, and it deceives people. I mean, and this might have sounded strange just a couple years ago to people, but you have to wonder, why can't people see this? And it is part of what this demonic thing does, is it pulls you down, and you see through flesh, whether through spiritual eyes, what's unfolding. But keep the will and imagination focused.
Right.
So don't allow outside forces to pervert your own. And it's been said, even among scholarly, we can go to, whether it's scholarly or psychological, or certainly dense in the literature, and I can focus on Dostoevsky in particular, but mass psychosis is a demonically charged phenomenon. Like, people could disagree. If you're a materialist, not going to buy that, but it's demonically charged. And it's been said many times that people lose their mind in groups, but they regain it individually. And it's a much slower process. So not kind of letting yourself get swept away. And it, I'm sympathetic to any movement right now that will challenge the standard narrative. But we also have to be very careful, in terms of getting swept away with the crowd.
Right. And I think like acceptance of suffering, to bring it back again to like the Catholic tradition of redemptive suffering. And that was one of the effects of the Second Vatican Council, is the removal of the sense of awaiting another life, or an eschaton that's beyond this one. It's, the here and now, and what we can do in this life, and the fraternity and solidarity that we can create in the here and now is our duty as Christians, rather than to suffer and await, the fulfillment on the other side of this life. You'll hear a lot of Protestants talk about like this prosperity gospel, the Joel Osteens, and these televangelists who are always promising, like, if you follow God, you're going to live your best life now, and you're going to have earthly pleasures and wealth and prosperity. That rejection of earthly suffering, acceptance of suffering, is what I'm trying to get at, is a way of reunifying ourselves with the cosmic chain of being, and not being swept away in with the new normal. The reason people are being compelled to accept the new normal is because they reject suffering. They don't want to feel like they're going to be withheld from their previous pleasures and fun and activities. They want those things to come back, and they're willing to undergo whatever type of submission that they can to have those things, rather than to say, I reject whatever those things are, and I accept suffering until we can regain some level of absolute truth, or we can return to the idea of governance that we've been operating under up to this point, apparently. So
yeah, there's a lot of obstacles, Catholics, agnostics, Protestants, but we've been working at it this way, because it's not like maybe a switch you turn on, but there's kind of a continuum. And we're working with this idea of the binding versus the loosening. So the binding, what binds us to reality, what binds us to the metaxy is hierarchy. And modern individualistic people don't like hierarchy, right? Especially when the person at the top of the hierarchy is an apostate or a heretic. It's problematic, but it was prophesized. So we bind yourself to reality by the things that we just mentioned, holding on to tradition and the sacraments. And that order between the individual, society, and the cosmos is in balance. The more our consciousness and our faith moves toward that, there's a binding, there will be slowing of chaos. I know we think we have to have a political solution, and sometimes it is effective to go to City Hall or hold a sign, but we're saying what any act that we can do to help bind this will slow down the chaos. The idea of the chaos is the loosening of the hierarchy, the loosening of the vertical. And you do that, in 100 different ways, but you problematize the vertical order by subjectivizing it, relativizing it. And you do that in order to attempt to grab the essence of the radiation and transpose it into the vertical project, the utopian project that's always ongoing, that always ends again in derailment and chaos. So it's kind of the loosening, and the little bits that we do matter, in that sense. And it is, part of our faith is what we do. It is deeper than just where we cast our consciousness, but how we conduct our days and our personal responsibility, and how we direct that again toward tradition and a vertical order, which is increasingly difficult for modern people, especially once modernism has entered the church, which is, again, Christ Church and the final bastion that's going to hold together in this age, earth and heaven and earth. And you probably had some ideas too. I think you were the one that originally, I liked it one time we were talking, and you mentioned the phrase binding something to reality. So what reality is, it's very vague. I don't watch Joe Rogan, and I tend not to watch Jordan Peterson, but I caught a cut of that. And if you can capture this idea, he's really essentially talking about, he just did it this week in an interview, I believe. And he's talking about perception through the Western mind of how do we even grasp reality he's talking about. And the book of books, when you take this funnel down, is the Bible, and Shakespeare comes from it, and Milton comes from it. And so that frames your interconnection of ideas and your understanding. So the book, it's not only true factually, but in a much more profound sense, it's the truth of all truths that creates that from the material to the supernatural. And I thought that was a pretty interesting conversation, because what he's essentially saying is this Bible and the tradition are the operating platforms of Western civilization. When we're going from here to the next stage, that they need to suck off this economy, because this economy that we're presently living in, even in the soft economy of the fourth industrial revolution, it's still predicated upon the idea of individual rights, comes from the individual, and his rights in a free market come from the God of nature, a transcendental God, generally understood, but it was kind of vague in the articles, the Declaration of Independence. It could also be Masonic if you want to. But anyway, it's sucking off that. It's even parasiting off the fourth industrial revolution in order to go to the circular information economy, which will essentially be the Marxist utopia repackaged. It's the stateless church where everything withers away. There's no more there's no more conflict. It's almost identical to Teilhard de Chardin. He was the Jesuit paleontologist, mid-century, wrote The Phenomenon of Man. It's another tear inside the church that is just a repackaging with a glossy Catholic Christian veneer, the Marxist project of immanentizing the eschaton, or bringing heaven down to earth, which is a project that began heavily with the creation of all of these Gnostic faiths that were apes of the church in the 1st and 2nd century. And what's also interesting, and I had seen this in another source, and it's kind of a side idea, but Hoffman does mention how Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great, it's always sold to us, and it was certainly sold to the people in the Renaissance as this kind of contemporary of Moses and great wisdom that probably even preceded Moses, and it's kind of the nut that brings all world religions together. But it's a red herring, and it was really created in the late 1st century. It was a forgery that presented itself as ancient mystery, but it was just another Gnostic repackaging. And again, for Vogelin, the problem with Gnosticism, he's using the word, because again, it gets bandied around, he's using the word essentially as a psychological disorder. And you're not in the balance. If you want to understand the balance that the Logos brought in, it's balance between the heavens and the earth, the forms, the thought forms, and the physical. And that's why the physical nature of the church balances so well the individual society and the cosmos, because it reflects the divine plan of God, that God became man so that man could become God. And that part of that process is that God is going to create a redemptive history through his own creation, through man, and through the physical aspects of creation that all lead ultimately into the eschaton, that is the beatific vision, the completion of all things, and the new heaven and the new earth. And that is the ape of the church is trying to do that project through the will and imagination, the collective will and imagination of man, which perverts the cosmic order. That perversion causes social chaos. The most profound and simplistic case, you can look at the damage Calvin did, not to pick on Calvin, but with the Protestant Reformation. And I can go through a number of bullet points from then on that you see that this perversion always links, we can go to the French Revolution and on, this perversion to out and out disorder. Will, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking about going back to the wheat and the tares, this duplicity of roles, for instance, in the Inquisition, the way in which these, Renaissance magi could conceal their influence within the church structure is by creating, a witch hunt, or they could identify someone else as the terror, as the intruder who is spreading this false light into the church, and in so doing they conceal their own role. And this seems to be a strategy of redirecting blame and concealing one's influence. And
an idea I like from Tomberg is this, whether he's talking about the emperor, which again, he's thinking more of an idea, a very classical idea of an Augustinian idea of a city of God and a city of man, and that we create a social order that reflects the heavenly kingdom. And that was kind of an understanding that was present all the way up until, the monarchies in the 19th century tried to preserve that idea. Tomberg is going to talk about a mystical power in the seats of the emperor and in the seats of the papacy and even the cardinals. And so, whereas the Sedevacantists would say the seat is vacant, I think that's problematic, because what you're recognizing is the seat rather than the individual. So even in times of apostasy, you recognize the hierarchy by recognizing the mystical connection between the seat and the vertical order. And I think sometimes people can maybe get a little carried away with the personality of all of it, especially the contemporary, the current Pope in particular, but the post-Vatican popes, and become disgruntled and maybe just want to leave the church altogether, or claim that the sacraments are dead, or it's the end of it. These are all kind of dead end routes to me. There's also problematic to see the apostasy and resist. There's a little bit of problems with that. so there, it is a landmine of problems everywhere you look, and it's a world of chaos right now, and that's why the church is a microcosm of it. And I think that although solutions like this sound a little bit um, like you're side skirting what you can do, these are very solid things you can do with your consciousness. I believe that will have effects, but again, it's an uphill battle. People lose their minds very rapidly in groups. They regain them slowly, individually, one person at a time. So part of, the fullness of the Catholic faith is just not putting all your eggs in the faith basket, but realizing there's a totality that we're asked, part of these virtues are faith, love, hope, and charity. And in there is hope. And we're hoping not only for the eschaton, but along the way, we're commanded to love God, love our neighbors, and we're commanded to spread the gospel. So in times of, and if shit hits the fan, you have commandments throughout all of it. Love God, love your neighbor, as difficult as it can be, and continue to spread the gospel. Because I don't think that there's any one indicator that's ever been given that this age is over until Christ literally returns. So we should assume that he's still present in the sacraments and that we're still commanded. It's not, hey, there's an assumption always here. If I'm telling you to love me, I've already given you the grace. So don't even think about that. And a priest at my church said last week, and it's powerful. He said, love, you can have the faith, Martin Luther, that could move mountains, but without love, it's meaningless. That's pretty powerful language. And he goes, I'm telling you something. Love, he said, and it hit me. He said, love is not a feeling. Love is an action. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, so that we might participate in eternity and be permanently attached to something that we were already designed to do. We were designed to worship God. And I know people in the world don't like it, but that, when you scrape away our fallen nature, that's truly how we were designed and what we were designed to do. And so part of what we're working out here when we work out our salvation is preparing ourselves for that servitude to the creator of all things. And my take is that I do, there's always a disconnect between who God is and how we understand him, but we are made in the image of God. God, although we don't quite understand it, is perfect love and perfect justice. And sometimes we just have to, through the eyes of faith, slog it out. We don't always need the confidence of coming up with some novel doctrine that's going to make us always completely assured of our salvation, because first and foremost, we're asked to worship God, then understand his will. From those two things that should follow, we should have a reasonable confidence in our own personal salvation and the restoration of all of creation. But that's most of what I got. I can't imagine I'm going to come up with something else, but I don't know, maybe what you're going to say next will trigger me.
No, absolutely, Doug. I think this has been a fruitful conversation here, especially on your part. And I think we can leave a little fruit on the vine for next time. If you're ready to wrap things up, I'm pretty happy with this.
Yeah, it's cold in here, so
Yeah.
I should probably get going. I enjoyed, as usual, Will, our chat. For everybody out there that's still checking in on Dr. Deep State, I want to thank you for participating, watching, being a part, whether you're somebody that's new to Dr. Deep State or you've been around for a while. It's been a ride. It's been an interesting ride. And I really hope with the collaboration and the help of Will that we can make some real headways in the next few months in this book, So I'm going to leave it at that. Will, I wish you a great day, and everybody out there. And Dr. Deep State Land, thank you for checking in again with Inside the Medicsy. This has been Will and Doug. I'll see you all, and I hope you all are doing well.